Thank you so much for having me this morning. It's really fantastic to be here. I think that it's kind of appropriate because we're here in New York City today, and it is pouring. It's been pouring for a long time, and I think that every time this happens, our infrastructure is tested a little bit. And anybody that had some transportation problems this morning or saw a lot of water standing in potholes all over the streets, I think it's a reminder that of this issue of the fact that New York City has a lot of work to do when it comes to its infrastructure. My train was about 15 minutes late today getting to work because of the infrastructure issues caused by the weather. I run this think tank, the Center for an Urban Future, and I want to make it clear at the outset that we're not transportation experts. We're not infrastructure advocates. We're a think tank that focuses on the biggest and most important issues facing New York City's future. We write about small business growth, we write about higher education, we write about the skills gap, but we've come to the conclusion through a lot of research that the challenges that New York faces with its aging infrastructure is one of the biggest issues facing this city. And I know it's not unique to New York, but for a city that was built up in much of the early part of the 20th century, so much of our infrastructure that's the foundation for the economic success of New York City is really in trouble. Whether it's the subways and the roads or the bridges or the underground infrastructure, so many things that we found are over 50 years old, and it's not just the age, but many of them are in various states of disrepair. And I will say that I think that things are a lot better than they were 25 or 30 years ago. In the late 70s, early 80s, there were track fires on the subway. We had to close bridges because of various states of disrepair. It was certainly more of an alarming state right then. But I think now we've just got to deal with so much state of good repair. So many things, if we don't start investing soon, we're going to be paying the price later. And it's really getting worse and worse, in part because the level of investment is stagnating or stalling. The federal government has really been disinvesting in infrastructure all over the country. The state and the city have really kind of thrown their hands up and have not been filling the gap. They face budget issues of their own. And I think that we did this report earlier this year to really try to, in a very comprehensive way, show that we have a problem, that this is a critical issue for New York, as it is for a lot of other cities, to highlight where the biggest problems are and to put forth some possible solutions for where we might go. So, I think that what I'd like to do is start a little bit with the kind of above-ground infrastructure, the streets, the highways, the bridges, and I think this is one of those ways. We talked to a lot of infrastructure experts and found that the streets were really one of the biggest problem areas for New York City. And let me give you a couple of quick stats. 30.4% of New York City's roads are only in poor or fair condition. That may not sound so bad, but when you compare it to about a decade ago, the number was 15.7%. So we are, the roads in the city have deteriorated since then. And one of the reasons is that if you look at the slide, this shows the lane miles in New York City that have been reconstructed. And in the report, we break down how there's kind of two major fixes that we see fairly often, but not often enough in New York City, and that is reconstructing the roads and resurfacing them. And the one thing that happens far more often is the resurfacing. And every year, New York City DOT sets a goal of resurfacing 1,000 lane miles because so many roads fall, out of a state of good repair every year. But only 3 years since 2000 has the city met that target of 1,000 lane miles being resurfaced. And during this period, the average amount of lane miles resurfaced every year is about 852. So we're falling short in that area, but we're also falling very short in the lane miles reconstructed. And this is one thing that, you know, the roads get beat up so much in New York, especially after last year's very tough winter, but you can't just repave. You know, you have to get to some of the kind of foundational issues. And so, you know, the DOT experts also recommend that they reconstruct a lot of the streets from time to time. And we have, as the slide shows, been slipping in this year. And between 06 and 07, there were 136 miles reconstructed. Then it was 112 the next year. But then in the two most recent years, the numbers have gone down to 75 and 80 lane miles reconstructed per year. So that's an issue. I think also bridges have become an issue, and you know, this is a city where there's well over 1,000 bridges, not just the big ones that a lot of people are aware of, like, you know, the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge, but, you know, so many bridges over you know, the BQE and the Cross Bronx Expressway. There's lots and lots of bridges, and about 11% of them were deemed structurally deficient in 2012. And one of the reasons is that the bridges are just old. More than 160 bridges across the 5 boroughs were built over a century ago. And so while 162 were structurally deficient, actually 47 of them were both structurally deficient and fracture critical. So this is a designation that engineers use for bridges that have little structural redundancy, making them prone to failure and collapse. You know, this is obviously, the bridges being structurally deficient is kind of one of those crisis points, and something that I think DOT officials have been very cognizant of. I think in recent years they've focused more attention on the bridges, but what happens then is it's almost like the little boy plugging a hole in the dike. As the bridges start to get a little bit better, other things are kind of in fairly worse shape. And so we heard people from DOT and others telling us that as there was a focus more on the bridges in the last decade, the roads and the highways suffered a little bit. You know, obviously, so many New Yorkers rely on the subway system, and this is above and below ground, but certainly a major part of the public transportation infrastructure in New York. And in this area, you know, I think that we have to hand it to the MTA for making significant strides over the past 20 or 25 years. Anybody that rode the subway system then and now know that there was a real dedication to bringing the infrastructure along, investing in new subway cars, fixing tracks, and but even still, there are some real problem areas with the subway infrastructure. We found that of the 728 miles of mainline signals, about 37%, 269 of the miles, have exceeded their 50-year useful life, and 26% are more than 70 years old. So there's a price to pay for that, and I think a lot of us see it on a regular basis. It slows the movement of trains, and you know, what was really interesting is that we saw that, you know, there's the equipment is so out of date that maintenance workers have to build their own replacement parts because the manufacturers no longer make them. So there are other issues with the subways. The stations are in very bad shape really throughout the 5 boroughs. The subway station repair yards are almost 100 years old on average, or are in bad shape. You know, all of these things are fundamental to how we get around in New York City. You know, and this is a city of more than 8 million people. It is a global city, and our economic competitiveness, our quality of life, our ability to attract people to live and work here is really based on people's ability to get around easily. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have a modern transportation infrastructure. And when people are, met with subway delays on a regular basis, when there are major tie-ups on the roads and highways because they're being repaired all the time or they're in bad shape, that ultimately is a knock on the city and affects our economic competitiveness. Obviously, the transportation infrastructure is just one facet of New York City's infrastructure, and our report, Caution Ahead, takes a look at a lot of other important things as well, and certainly one other area that has gotten a lot of attention in recent years is our underground infrastructure. And it was very tragic and uncanny, but literally the day after we published this report in March was the East Harlem explosion that many believe was triggered by old and rusty, leaky gas mains in East Harlem. And obviously, not every bit of aging infrastructure leads to kind of a tragic event like that, but it certainly underlines what could happen if regular investments are not made. And so, just a little bit on this, the average age of the gas mains in New York City is 56 years old, and the sewage mains are 84 years old on average. Water mains are 69 years old. And let me talk about water mains for just a second. Our water infrastructure, I think, doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But this is also one of those things that I think regularly impacts the ability of New Yorkers to get around. Forget about just the need for clean and safe water, but there are, for more than a decade now, there have been more than 400 water main breaks a year in New York City, actually every year but one for the last 12 or 13 years. In 2013, there were 403 water main breaks. Not all of them are huge and cause major disruptions, but a number of them do every year. There was a very big break in the Union Square area earlier this year. There was a big break over by Katz's Delicatessen, and they happen more and more often, in part because we have over 1,000 miles of water mains in this city that are more than 100 years old. And so there are frequent and disruptive breaks. And this is one of those things that I think one of our slides talks about how we have lost ground on water main replacement. Yes, every year, the city sets a goal of replacing about 68 miles of water mains, but we haven't met that target once over the last decade. And even in 2007, Mayor Bloomberg, in his very famous Plan YC document, promised to replace 80 miles of aging water mains every year. But since that time, we've only averaged 27 miles of water main replacement annually. So, these are difficult issues. This is old infrastructure. It's hard to get to. It's not easy to replace, and it costs a lot of money. And I think a lot of when there's limited funds, you see often money ends up going to higher profile things. Sometimes you have to address those bridges and other things suffer. But also, one of the things I'll probably get to a little bit later is that I certainly want to give Mayor Bloomberg a lot of credit for his investment in infrastructure. He greatly increased the overall capital budget for New York City, but one of the things that we talk about in our report was that state of good repair investments really lagged. There was a lot of investment in new things, new parks on the East River, on the west side of Manhattan, the water tunnel, which is very very important. Things like the 7 train expansion to the far west side, all of those things are great. New schools, the Mayor Bloomberg had invested in, but these kind of things, like we're seeing on the screen with the water main replacement, really suffered. Road resurfacing, road reconstructions, and I guess one of the major conclusions of our report is that we really need to get back to fixing things and not just investing in new infrastructure. Before I leave the underground infrastructure, you know, I did want to talk a little bit about the sewer mains as well, which the average age, we have about 6,400 miles of sewage mains, and the average age is 84 years, and approximately 4,000 miles of sewer pipe are made of vitreous clay, and these older pipes are more susceptible to cracking and blockage. And on a day like today in New York City, when it rains, you know, our sewage system is really overwhelmed, and it's just a fact of life in New York that you know, millions of gallons of sewage when it rains ends up in our waterways. And so this is not anything that New Yorkers want to see happen, but what has to occur is we need to be investing in newer sewer mains and other solutions, green infrastructure as well, that takes some of the burden off of our sewage infrastructure. So that's really a little bit about the underground infrastructure. And as Annalisa said, you know, I think another area we talk about in the report was the public buildings. Do you want me to go into that a little bit? You know, a lot of people don't think of things like our schools, public housing, our colleges and community colleges, or hospitals as part of the infrastructure, but it really is. These are public buildings, and they are a key part of the city, the city life, the city infrastructure, and so just as an example. More than 75% of NYCHA's residential buildings are over 40 years old. So that's the New York City Housing Authority. 531 of those buildings have been around since at least 1950, and we see consequences of that. Elevators are broken in so many NYCHA facilities. We see mold and unhealthy conditions. Of the 2,600 buildings in NYCHA, 1,500 do not comply with Local Law 11 standards for exterior and facade conditions. Also, we see it in our school buildings. Over 370 of the city's 12,000 public school buildings predate the Great Depression. In the school system, 36 different building exteriors, 69 mechanical systems, and 4 electrical systems are in need of immediate preventive maintenance. So all of these things really do add up. Other public buildings that we talk about, at CUNY, the average facility is over 50 years old, and homeless shelters are more than 70 years old on average. The average public hospital is 57 years old. If anybody's been to LaGuardia Airport recently, we know how old and in bad shape the central terminal is there, but at the airports, which are city-owned, the cargo buildings are also quite old and in bad shape as well. And so so these are things that all need to be really given a close look. We need to be investing and bringing up more of these city assets into a state of good repair. And you know, there's a real price to pay for all of this right now, and we see it on a regular basis. So you know, I think what we try to do with this report is really kind of put forth an inventory in a way that hadn't been done before. We're far from the only infrastructure group or people out there calling for infrastructure investments. There are people that know these issues a lot better than us, but I think what we were unique in doing was trying to lay everything out in one place, talking about the age and the level of disrepair that we're seeing and why it's so important. And you know, I'm really heartened by the fact that I think a number of policymakers are starting to talk about the need to invest in infrastructure, the need to come up with new solutions, and you know, I'm optimistic that that we'll be getting there soon. So should I talk a little bit about overall what's needed and the kind of recommendations we have, Annalisa?
Sure, that would be great. And then again, I've also got your statistics and some of the metrics on what we need in order to get to that state of good repair. So moving on to the second half of the presentation.
Great. Well, well, that's a great segue. I mean, I think that, you know, I did neglect to mention an important figure here, and that is $47 billion. And, you know, this is not going to be cheap. We added up. We didn't make up this number, but we added up what's actually publicly documented and found that just to bring all of the different assets that we focused on in this report up to a state of good repair, from you know, transit, roads, bridges, you know, public buildings, you know, the total is almost $50 billion. And we also found that that right now there's a gap of about $34 billion. So, you know, by far the majority of the $47 billion that's needed has not yet been funded. We all know that that the MTA alone has about a $15 billion gap right now in its own capital plan. But when you add up everything together, you know, there's over $34 billion that has not been funded, that needs to be, just to bring things into a state of good repair. And again, this is not aspirational investments. These are not things that we'd love to do. These are things that would just kind of get things into a good state of repair. You know, and so, you know, when it comes to what can the city do, and obviously we'd all love for the federal government to reinvest in infrastructure.
I was just going to ask as well if you wanted to talk about the spending of the administration, and just wanted to find out where we are as far as where that gap is, right? And where the investments happen in the last few years.
Sure. Well, you know, I think that what's on the slides now show that, as I mentioned earlier, Mayor Bloomberg really did make a significant increase in infrastructure spending over recent years. You can see here that that he increased spending over the two prior mayoral administrations, and I think that's to his credit. He saw the importance of infrastructure, but you know, if I have one fault, it's just that there was less of a focus on fixing things and bringing things into a state of good repair. You know, every mayor is able to have their own priorities when it comes to infrastructure investment, and you know, I think Mayor Bloomberg put more of an emphasis on cultural institutions. There was more investment helping to make New York, keep New York as a global city. I think those were important things. Spent a couple $2 billion just on cultural budget. There was investments in new parks, a significant investment in new schools. That was at least in part triggered by some new money the state made available for new school construction. You know, I think that, and I mentioned earlier the water tunnel and the 7 train extension, which is being paid for by the city and not the MTA. You know, it's impressive what the city has done to invest in infrastructure, but when you have a city as old as ours, and so many things are falling into various states of disrepair, you need to make some of the unsexy investments. You need to really put some money into a state of good repair, and I think that's where things really fell short in recent years. I mentioned earlier that when it comes to road resurfacing and water main replacement, there was we were falling short. We fell behind in some of those areas. There's a lot that can be done, and I think that we'd like to say that if the city does not really make this a priority, if the new de Blasio administration and the Cuomo administration, Albany does not do more to invest in some of this, then I think the city's economic competitiveness and quality of life will deteriorate, and there will be long-term costs for New York. We'd all love for the federal government to get back in the game and to fund infrastructure. It's kind of amazing that we haven't seen more of that in recent years, especially given that this is not just a New York City problem, that all sorts of other cities and areas across the country face similar issues. But I think that for a city as important as New York, we can't wait. We can't wait for the federal government to act, and it really is incumbent upon city and state officials to find some fixes for this. And our report talks about a few of those, and I think that number one is probably we need to really identify some new dedicated revenue sources. I think that this is you see on the screen here some of the kind of main recommendations of our report. But we need to find some dedicated revenue sources. And I think as the first bullet point on the screen mentions, this can really fit into the goals of Mayor de Blasio and his administration. We've heard a lot of talk about addressing inequality, putting more New Yorkers on the path to the middle class. But, I mentioned at the outset, we're a think tank that's written a lot about the economy. We've written a lot about jobs, and frankly, it's difficult to figure out where are the middle-income jobs going to come from, at least middle-income jobs that are accessible to people without a college degree. And investment in infrastructure brings a lot of blue-collar jobs. This is something that if we pour money into addressing some of these state of good repair needs, it really could help the mayor create some decent-paying jobs across New York City. And so I think that's one of the selling points, but I think that to get there, we need to be looking at dedicated revenue sources, because one-time fixes are really important. And I know, and I think it's a great thing that in Albany we're talking about using some of the settlement money that's now available, somewhere around $4 or $5 billion that have come to the state through settlements with banks and other things that should be used for infrastructure, undoubtedly so. But we need to find recurring long-term revenue sources, and that's where and I think that's where I think so far elected officials and government officials have come up a little short. But our report talks about a few of them. I think that the place to start is probably with some kind of congestion pricing or tolling over the East River bridges. Given the state of our transportation infrastructure, it just does not make sense right now to not be charging a fee to users over the East River bridges. And, it's really unique what's happening there. And obviously, politically, this is a challenge, but we've seen Sam Schwartz, the transportation expert, propose a very sound plan to do this that would actually add new tolls on the East River bridges while reducing tolls on bridges that don't enter the Manhattan Business District. So this has picked up support by the Automobile Club in New York City. It's picked up support by politicians on Staten Island, which often are groups that are opposed to plans like this one to toll the bridges. So there's some possibility with this proposal proposal, and it would add dedicated recurring revenue for the transportation investments that are so badly needed. We talk about a surface water management fee. Right now, we have a water board and water fees in New York City on property owners, but the surface water management fee is an incentive to capture rainwater before it enters sewers. I mentioned earlier how important that is, and cities like Seattle and Philadelphia currently apply stormwater charges, and what it does is it really puts a charge on basically how how porous your surfaces are in your buildings and properties. So the more green elements for your buildings, such as grass, gardens, green roofs, and permeable concrete, the lower the fee you pay. So this is definitely kind of more of an incentive-based water fee that we think we can move into, and that a lot of cities have been thinking about and actually implementing in recent years. There are other things that have been mentioned, such as waste-to-energy facilities, residential parking permits, that could be long-term revenue sources that the city should consider. In addition, we talk about the need to capture value from infrastructure projects. One of the interesting conversations I remember with Chris Ward, the former head of the Port Authority, was to see all of the investment and the value created on the far west side of Manhattan as a result of the park, the Hudson River Park, that was built there in large part almost entirely with public monies, but the city not really kind of capturing that value to help pay for those infrastructure investments. I think in a city where property values have increased as a result of public actions like that, we need to be thinking about value creation, value capture, and so we haven't done that enough in New York. In London, they have a community infrastructure levy that helped finance major infrastructure improvements, such as that city's Crossrail, which is a new commuter line connecting the suburbs to central London, and surrounding neighborhoods were assigned to one of three zones, depending on how close they were to the new line, and they had to pay some kind of a fee based on the development that was occurring and was benefiting their properties. So those are a few things when it comes to dedicated revenue sources, but our report also really points out that it's not money alone that's needed here, that we have to make sure that the money we do have goes farther. And obviously, one thing that comes to mind is just how much infrastructure investment and infrastructure building costs in this city. And so we really need to be getting a handle on those costs, lowering the costs, and so we have several recommendations around bringing down infrastructure costs. Design build, we are huge fans of in this report. We talk about how it has helped save money in a bunch of situations. We advocate for, reauthorizing design build at the state level, but we say don't stop there. Why should we only be doing design build on state agency projects? It'd be great if municipalities were given the authority to be able to do design build, and that hasn't happened yet, but we think that's something that the state officials should be allowing. We talk about avoiding low bids from unqualified contractors. This is an area that where costs ends up being ballooned. We talk about reducing the time to design and approve construction contracts, and the need to renew current labor agreements. I would add that in addition to bring down infrastructure costs, we need to innovate. We need to come up with innovative new ideas for for building and infrastructure and saving money. And so, one of those things is, I think, using technology. I think that we have to look over the next several years at a way where technology investments could be undertaken to make our infrastructure investments more efficient. And I think we've only scratched the surface of that in New York City. So, there's a lot more that could be done. I think that we're hoping that this report is a good jumping-off point.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I know also what just a lot of people just was just curious to find out. It's been like great recommendations, great overview in the report as well. Again, as I mentioned to everybody at the beginning, that we will share the report with you by registering in today's webinar. And some of the folks here also just wanted to kind of ask, how did it evolve as far as the report itself, and where did Center for Urban Age start, and how did they end up getting tasked with creating a report like this?
That's a great question. We really did this on our own. I think that in the aftermath of the 2012 Superstorm Sandy, there was so much focus on, what we as a city need to do to prepare for the next storm. But the more we poked around on that issue and others, it became clear to us that as important as those resiliency efforts are, we have other infrastructure issues in New York that go beyond preparing for the next storm. And so, it really struck us that no one had done a really comprehensive evaluation of the kind of entirety of New York City's infrastructure challenges. And we wanted to take a look at the aging infrastructure. And so, we set out with a couple of partners. Our report was funded by the Association for a Better New York and RBC Capital Markets. When we had the support to really delve into this, we spent almost a year really tracking down data, interviewing engineers and experts in all facets of infrastructure in New York, and ended up publishing in March. This is such an issue for so many global cities. We didn't do a comprehensive comparison with New York and other cities, but, there were areas where we did kind of do contrasts. And, one of them in particular was around the cost of construction, for instance. And we found that in 2012, replacing or repairing public school electrical and mechanical systems in New York City cost 67% more than in Denver, 46% more than in Seattle, and 18% more than in Chicago. In Tokyo, the cost of building a new subway line is about $48 million per mile. In Paris, it's about $368 million per mile. But in New York, our 2nd Avenue subway and 7 train extension have each cost the MTA well over $2 billion per mile. So, that's one area where New York kind of doesn't stack up well against other cities. Clearly in Asia, we're seeing major investments in infrastructure, and I think we're falling behind in a big way. It's hard to compare what's happening in a city like Beijing or Shanghai, given all of the kind of command control economies we see there, the amount of investment that those governments are putting in, those national governments, and their ability to, plow over existing communities and do things quickly in a way that will never happen and shouldn't happen in a city like New York. But in a lot of ways, we are falling behind some of the newer, faster-growing cities.
That's an interesting point as well. And I'm just curious to find out, too, so you mentioned about the government funding, right, and from other cities and other countries as well. And I'm just trying to find out, so what is right now the history or just the evolution or just like any future funding. You talked about trying to get the recommendations and getting more revenue sources. Is that forthcoming? I know every time you open up the newspaper these days, it all talks about between the mayor and the state, right? So that's one. And then secondly, any other federal funding that we can happen, and especially since we should also bring into the conversation on Superstorm Sandy, right, and the resiliency conversation. Can we talk more about, either funding or sources or plans for the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think federal funding is really, a foundational issue for this. I'll give you a couple of quick stats. The federal government funded 78% of New York City Transit's 1975 to 78 capital budget, but only 25% of the MTA budget for 2010-2011. The federal government contributed $420 million to the New York City Housing Authority's capital budget in 2001, but only $256 million in 2013. It sent $267 million in sewage and drinking water grants to New York State in 2000, but only $203 million in 2013. So there's just a few quick examples of how money has kind of been dwindling from the federal government in terms of infrastructure. I think that there's been so much paralysis in Washington. I think a lot of people thought that infrastructure was going to be one of those areas where we could see bipartisan cooperation and agreement, but it really hasn't happened. And, maybe I'm a little naive, but maybe one impact of the change in party leadership in Washington with basically the Congress being controlled now by the Republican Party and the White House by the Democrats, maybe it will actually create kind of the impetus for some kind of agreement around a few issues, and infrastructure has a good chance of being one of them. That said, I don't think New York City should wait on that. I think in so many areas, cities have really understood that they need to just go ahead and do things innovatively on their own now. I think we can't wait for the federal government, and I think the city needs to come up with its own revenue solutions for infrastructure issues. As far as Superstorm Sandy, this is one of those things that is certainly not unique to New York. I think with climate change and all sorts of climate issues, cities, are in danger in a lot of ways. We're going to see more of these things that were, once called 100-year storms, but I think they're going to be more regular in the years ahead. And New York City, according to so many different studies and reports, is really in the crosshairs. We're going to see flooding. We're going to see major storms in a way that was not very regular until recently. And so, I can't remember what the number is, but so many New Yorkers are in a floodplain right now. So much of the city's built environment is in areas that are in jeopardy. And so we need to be investing in storm preparedness, resiliency. Under Mayor Bloomberg, there was certainly kind of a fairly good plan that was put out there for what the city should do. But more of it needs to be funded. I haven't heard a whole lot of details from Mayor de Blasio yet on some of these issues, but I'm really pleased with some of the leadership that they have around resiliency. I know they have actually gotten the Build It Back program back on track. It was really foundering and had some major problems under Mayor Bloomberg, and so I'm definitely heartened by what I'm seeing there. But I think that there's more of an appetite now for New Yorkers to look at these issues and to make the investments that are necessary to make sure we don't have the kind of impact that Sandy had a couple of years ago.
That's great to know, and I know as well that this is not like a problem only unique to New York, and that we also have to look at our community and our neighbors. And I'm just talking as well, not just with the issues with the subway and the highways and tunnels, but we also talk about the airports earlier on and part of that is with Port Authority. So we're looking at New Jersey borders and Connecticut as well. So all of those are interesting conversation. And I know what we're planning on doing today is not just like having a conversation about the report and the recommendations as well, but this is a lot to cover within an hour. We also just wanted to make sure that everybody else is aware that we hope that this is just at the beginning of actually a series of webinars that we will be doing with the Center for Urban Age. And on that note, I also wanted to go over to their website right now, right? So now you have recommendations. You've also spoken about the report as well. I just wanted to find out what else is in store for Center for Urban Age beyond the report, and if you could just talk more about your organization.
Sure. Well, it is the Center for an Urban Future, first of all. no big deal.
My apologies.
But anybody can go to nycfuture.org. We really are a think tank. We're independent. We don't take any money from government. And we try to look at research and publish studies about the critical opportunities facing New York. Our focus has been on how do we grow and diversify New York's economy and how do we expand economic opportunity. And so, we look at a range of things. One of the big issues that in recent months we've been taking a look at are the state of New York City's branch libraries. We put out a study over the summer, actually in September, called Re-envisioning New York's Branch Libraries. And this actually relates to the infrastructure discussion we're having right now. New York has 207 branch libraries, and even in an age of the Kindle and e-books, more New Yorkers than ever are going to their public libraries. They are not just offering books, they're offering workshops, classes, programs, and people really are eating it up, and they're important for New York, but the average library in New York is 61 years old, and overall, New York has 3 library systems, the New York Public Library, the Queens Library, and the Brooklyn Public Library, and together those 3 systems have $1.1 billion in state of good repair needs. So, and very little capital funding has been going to the libraries, and so, there's leaky roofs, there's boiler problems, there's all sorts of fundamental state of good repair issues. But then in addition to that, a lot of the branch libraries have issues that many of these older branches just aren't configured for how New Yorkers are using libraries today. Their community rooms are too small. We found that so many branches have just a few electrical outlets. So people are going to the libraries and trying to, plug in smartphones or laptops. That's how people want to use libraries today. But people are finding that the branches just don't have outlets to let them work there. And so that's just one example of how we need to be reimagining and rethinking and investing in our branch libraries.
Sounds great. And again, I just wanted to, ask that if there's anybody else who wanted to try and find out more about, like, how do you support Center for an Urban Future, we want to thank Jonathan actually for, presenting here and talking about their reports. But there's various other ways that you can support the center. There are in a city with hundreds of organizations that advocate for specific constituencies, and Center for Urban Future has set itself apart. And we, as you could see here, not just with their journalistic approach to policy, in their fact-driven and nonpartisan way, and that basically can be consumed to a wide audience, but also the studies consistently influence the policy debate. But we also need support from our friends and colleagues like yourselves, and helps them with ability to develop new programs, to have more reports and more conversations like this that can be helpful for you.
Well, thank you, Annalisa. I mean, I think that for a lot of the people listening today, clearly we have had an impact with this infrastructure work. It really has gotten a lot of attention in the media. The City Council, the Mayor have run with a number of our recommendations already. So I think there's a role for us in this city and in this state. And I think that by putting together fact-based research, innovative, fresh ideas, ideas in a way that's trusted, as I think we are, we're able to raise the profile of important issues and put good ideas in front of policymakers, and they are listening. And so, we're a nonprofit. We do depend on donations and support. We don't take government money. And so if there's anybody out there that likes what they're hearing, obviously we'd appreciate, tax-deductible donations at this time of year. But if you want to find out more, go to our website also. We have over 10,000 followers on Twitter. We're fairly active at NYC Future. You can follow us there and learn a little bit more about us. If you think you might have colleagues or friends that like to learn more, feel free to do that as well. And you can find my information on the website as well. And feel free to reach out to me if you have ideas for studies or how we can kind of keep working on these infrastructure issues and try to get some impact.